So you will see these two pictures, and this picture right here is of Nelson Mandela, and this is of Russian composer Dmitry Shostakovich. And then so these two figures are very similar in that they both were targeted by the government. And Nelson Mandela was targeted for his anti-apartheid movement, and that landed him in jail. And so in his work, A Long Walk to Freedom, he writes about his time in jail, his need to be resilient, and his optimism during that time. And Shostakovich, he was targeted because he was a composer, and in Soviet Russia at the time, he was, musicians were very restricted in what they could write. And then so, this is my presentation about the state, socialism, and Shostakovich. And then so my research question is, to what extent did the Soviet government's impacts on Shostakovich during the 1920s and 70s influence his composed works? And based on the research, it was concluded that the politics of 20th century Soviet Union heavily influenced Shostakovich's music. First, through the enduring relationship between the government and state, which was especially notable during this time due to government policies that forced people to adapt, and because of the repressive tactics and music's abstract nature that allows irony and subversion. So first of all, music and the state. So this table by Ramel, who was a political scientist who taught at Yale and University of Hawaii, it shows the 15 most lethal regimes, and then you will notice that they all happened in the 20th century and that they're all either authoritarian or communist. And then so this implicates two things. First, that during the 20th century there was a lot of repressive regimes that attempted to take as much power as they could while quashing out any other resistance, and that also that more undemocratic governments that were authoritarian and communist were also the ones most likely to do this. And then so, more specifically, this relates to Shostakovich because the Soviet Union, where he lived, was emblematic of the major events of the 20th century and participated in the two world wars, Cold War, and dictatorship, and that is also included in the list of the highly deadly regimes. And then so, the relationship between power and music is a historical one, but it is special in Shostakovich's case because regimes at this time used music to serve their interests, as shown by this quote by Botstein, Leon Botstein, who is a political scientist, and because musicians depended on the state. And then so, to my second perspective, resilience. So, just for context, here are some of the major events that shaped Shostakovich in relation to the research question. So in 1926, he published his first symphony for his conservatory, and then in 1932, the Union of Soviet Composers established, which marked the beginning of the Soviet control over music, because if the composers didn't write what the government wanted, they would be sanctioned. And in 1936, a piece in the Pravda paper excoriated Shostakovich's famous opera, and that is a major turning point in his life. And in 1948, the second announcement, which this was the first announcement, targets composers again, but more extremely. So socialist realism was the type of music that the government espoused during this time. And then so it was supposed to be socialist, positive, and realistic in that it advanced that it was not tainted by Western influences. And then during the second announcement in 1948, it was supposed to sound refined, harmonious, and melodious. And then so, generally music was supposed to sound heroic and tonal. And then so it was anti-formalist, especially against African themes, because those could go against the government. And then this aimed to advance the ideals of communism and the Soviet regime, because they wanted music to sound accessible while also uplifting. Artists who did not comply would face consequences, and their works would be banned being played as Shostakovich understood. And so this chart shows Soviet democide and annual rate by period. So this period of the Soviet socialist realism would be around the pre-World War II and World War II and post-war. And you can see that the Soviet democide rate is very high, which shows like the fear factor that played into the artists. So there were several debates about the meaning of Shostakovich's music and whether or not he actually agreed with socialist realism. But the thesis is that Shostakovich was impacted by the government and society to a significant extent. Richard Turskin, who was a very prominent Shostakovich scholar, argued that the government's policies led Shostakovich to more use the socialist realism style, which led to his most likely playing his piano quintet, because otherwise he would not have used the violist style in terms of quintet. And then so George Wichert, who is a lawyer, he outlined these strategies for survival. And these strategies for survival were the ones that Shostakovich used, and it shows his resilience during his time. So he wrote propaganda music that would please the regime, such as his seventh symphony called Leningrad, again, and interpretation. He allowed the state to freely interpret the more abstract pieces without denying it. Movies, he composed music for movies to earn money, and this is shows the government's impact on him, because he would not have written the music for movies otherwise, because he didn't enjoy it. But because of the Soviet government's sanctions on music he didn't like, he had to do it in order to earn money. And so chamber music, he turned to this string quartet later in his career because he found it to be less controversial, because in the music scene in Russia at the time, string quartets were less prominent as were, say, the more orchestral pieces. In self-censorship, he would withdraw and keep some works private during the more repressive times, and so after Stalin's death in 1953, he published his work and fame. He allowed the government to benefit from his global renown. And then so this brings me to my third point of irony. So this quote by Henry Orlov in the Shostakovich playbook is from an interview, and it basically shows that the interpretive qualities of music allowed him to express ideals that would subvert the government's demands of socialist realism. And then so an example of this could be the DSCH motif. So Dmitri Shostakovich, the German transliteration of his name is this. And then so in the German notation system, it's D, E flat, C, and B. And then so you can see over here on the music scale, it's DSCH. And then so this motif is used in several of his works, including his Symphony No. 10, String Quartet No. 8, and Violin Concerto No. 2. And then so this shows the government's, that Shostakovich tried to use irony and go against the government, because he was trying to show that he was still had individualism in spite of Stalin's power. And so he used deception when he tried to deceive the government and the orderlies while expressing him to a smaller group, as in the Third and Fifth Symphony, where he adhered to the socialist realism style so much that it was seen as if he was mocking it. And in 10th Symphony, where he included things like allusions and jokes that would kind of go against the expectations. And so in conclusion, Shostakovich's music was greatly influenced by the Soviet regime because he displayed resilience, but also irony and resistance, and these are my works cited.
Two questions I have for you. First one, what information did you need that you weren't able to find?
So I wanted to find a graph on the democide of Soviet artists during the regime, but I found the one on the Soviet democide for the total population, and I found that to suffice in place because there were also anecdotes of Shostakovich's personal friends that influenced his career, and I found that to be enough in place of the Soviet democide of the actual artists.
Okay. And what additional questions emerged as you were doing your research?
So there were a lot, actually. There's a thing called the Shostakovich Wars, where people debate about his real intentions and whether or not he was an actual martyr or if he was actually just agreeing with the Soviet government. So I wanted to learn about what Shostakovich really believes, but there's a lot of conflicting viewpoints and evidence for that. So perhaps if I had more time or then I would look into that.